All right, so I just showed you how to create a React app from scratch, just using installing all the modules and all that. But let's go ahead and utilize the command utility or the command to actually create a React app to make our lives easier, so we don't have to go through all that stuff to get it up and running. Similar to that of Django, React has a built-in command to create the architecture for a React app. So what I'm going to do is make a directory called just intro to React, cd into intro to React. Whoop. Open that up into a new VS Code window. I'm going to go to the React documentation. React has really good documentation. You can read through it. Getting started, try React, has really good documentation. Add React to a website, talks about everything, the main concepts, advanced guides, etc. But creating a new React app. So there is a command called create React app followed by the app name. So what I'm going to do is run this npx. I forgot what npx is. It's like npm, but it has like an additional couple of features versus npm. It's a tool that uses executable packages. So it's essentially like almost very similar to npm. So I'm going to call npx. Think of that as just like npm. Create React app. What should I call this app name? I'll just call it counter. I'm going to call this app counter. So I'm going to create a new React app called counter, and it's going to do everything: installing node modules, installing React, React DOM, React scripts, all that stuff for me. So npx create React app counter. And just like installing React, all that stuff. What does it say? You're running node 12. Oh man, npm. Why am I using such a horrible? Use latest node version. Let's see. NVM. What is going on? Is anybody talking? Latest node. .16.4 latest features recommended for most users. 16.4.2. Why am I NVM use 16.14.2? Is that what it was? Not yet installed. What? Install. Hopefully this doesn't take that long. I'm wondering why I was using such a. All right. Cool. All right. I can check that node version or node V. All right, cool. So I'm going to do npx, run that again, create React app counter. Need to install the following packages. Okay, yes. You probably don't have to go through that part of it. So now it's installing packages. This might take a couple of minutes, which it usually is. So it's installing these four React, React DOM, React scripts, and this. I don't know what that is. So there's my counter app being created. And does anybody, what questions do y'all have so far?
Why do we not have to use a virtual environment with JavaScript or React and we do with Python?
Because each individual module or each individual package is installed in the node modules directory. And it's just how Python works. Python, you always have to use a virtual environment. Because when you usually do pip install, whatever, it installs it globally. Where here, everything is just contained to the directory of the application. Yeah.
So it kind of frees your system up, a virtual environment, because instead of having all these packages on your local computer with Python, it kind of isolates it into a bubble, so you can just use it for that particular app. Is that right?
For Python, it does. Yes. For here, it also does. Like when I do pip or package.json install, all the packages get installed just in this directory. So, is there a way I can see all npm list to see all the globally installed packages? To see globally install npm packages. Can't remember if there is it npm list.g? I can't even see. Okay. Yeah, anyway. But essentially, this package.json file does the same thing as like the virtual environment does, if you want to think of it like that. But Python's the only one that I think I don't want to say it's the only language, but Python is, you have to create a virtual environment. Most other languages, you do not.
Thank you.
All right. So if you looked at what just npm create React app counter did, it created an app called counter. And if I open that, we've got our node modules, which is, well, actually, let's first look at the package.json. So it created a package.json for us. It has the dependencies. So it's got React, React DOM, React scripts. It's got this web vitals. I don't know what that does. It's got some testing libraries. So Jest DOM, sure, it's got some testing libraries. It has some scripts for us. It's got the React script start. It's got this build, test, and eject. And it has some other elements to it as well, or configurations to it as well. Really don't have to know much about these. Anyway, it already comes with a get ignore. So it already, there's some like default things for get ignore. So like such as node modules. I don't know what this PNP is, coverage, build, some other local environments as well. So it's got the node modules, which is all the libraries and packages that are installed in this React app. It's got this public directory, and notice here's our index.html, and it's only got one div called the root. Doesn't really have anything else. It's got this no script tag, and it's also got some logos, some JSON, but you really don't have to know anything what these are. It's got the favicon in here, but everything is in our source directory, all the logic. So we've got our index.js, so we can look at what's being created. So it looks like on React 18, it's got this create root element or directory, or I'm sorry, method. So what is it? React DOM. So if you look up here, where is it? Create. So here, the render method, which I showed you yesterday or earlier when creating my own React app from scratch, I had that render method. Render has been replaced by create root in React 18. So that's a new feature for React 18, but render still works as well. So here we have React DOM create root, which is render. And here it looks like you create a variable called root, which grabs the element by its ID. So create root takes one argument, which is where you want to inject your components, and then root.render is where we actually are injecting our app.js component. You don't really need this React strict mode. This is just for like monitoring some items. You don't need this though. So it's rendering this app. So if I go to app.js, this is a function-based component. It's going to have a logo and it returns some JSX. So let's actually get this up and running. So if I just run npm start, what did I do? So if I list everything out, I'm not in my app yet. So I need to be inside of the counter. If I run that, npm start. So it's running localhost 3000. That's where localhost 3000 is where the React app is run. And here is the create React app splash page. Similar to that of the Django splash page. If you remember, React 1 has one as well. Any questions on that? So I can literally just remove all this stuff. If I wanted to get rid of that logo, so that image, that spinner, I can get rid of that. Save it. Now that's gone. And over, so I got rid of that logo. I can delete that. It's also using this app CSS. So here's the CSS for that page as well. It's got some test files. Don't worry about that. It's got some index.css. So for the entire body of the index.html. Here's SVG for the logo. You don't really need to know about report web vitals or anything like that. So the only files you really need to know is this index.html, or I'm sorry, index.js, which renders, I can get rid of that CSS. I don't even need React, but I can get rid of the strict mode. Everything will still work. So everything is still working. Yeah, but might as well just leave it there. All right. Any questions?
So
This?
app is your component, index.js renders it to
The DOM.
which is in your public folder, correct?
Correct. Yep. So this React DOM render and create root renders this app component wherever this get element by ID root is inside of your index.html. So it's going to render it right there. All right. So let's do some adjustments too. We can leave the index. Let's just actually start messing around with this component. So I'm going to remove all this stuff and just create H1 button, or I'll say hello world again. There we go. The reason why it's centered is because of this app. So inside of our index.css, this app class text align center. That's why everything is center. All right. So if you've already noticed here, this JSX, there is a little bit difference. So if I go actually all the way back, I won't go back, but notice how class, if you want to define a class in JSX, we use class name. It's because class is a reserved keyword for OOP. So if you want to define a new class, you could call class, whatever class name. So you can't use class to define a class in CSS. You need to say class name. So that's one of the subtle differences using JSX. Yeah. So let's go ahead and create some data and display some data in here. So let's create some state. So if you remember from here, let's actually we'll talk more about that later. We talked about state and props. So state is an object that stores data that is local to the component, similar to props. Let's talk about state. So React is a little different in that if I wanted to display some data, typically in your function, you want to be like counter equals 1 or 0, and say this function updates. Maybe there's a button that I click and it updates the counter and increments some counter, and that counter will display to the user. There's a specific way on how we set state that we want to use throughout our app and display to users, whatever data. So in React, if we want to display data to a user, we need to use something called hooks, a hook. And I need to import that hook, and it's called a use state hook. And this use state hook is a function that returns two values. It returns the initial data that you want, as well as a function to update that data. So, for example, if I wanted to create a counter variable, this function useState returns an array of two values, the initial variable, as well as a function to update this initial variable called set counter equals use state with initial value of 0. So what this function is doing, useState takes in an initial value of counter, whatever I want. Initially, it's going to be 0. So counter is a variable with a value of 0. And then also useState returns another value, which is a function that I'm calling set counter. And the set counter is a function that updates counter, because I can't just update counter by doing counter plus equals 1. I can't do that in React. I need a function to update my state. So counter is a state variable with an initial value of 0, like so. This can get confusing the first time, several times you're hearing about it.
Tom?
Yep.
Is set counter a function that we've yet to create?
No. So use state returns two values. It returns the initial state variable, which we define what we want to call that. So we're calling that one counter.
Okay.
So we're calling that initial state variable counter. And then the other value it returns is a function, an anonymous function that we get to determine what we want to call it. And we're calling it set counter. This is best practice. Whatever variable you call your state variable, the function you name, the function that updates that state variable will always be called set whatever the variable name is. But I could call this whatever I want, but it's best practice to call it set whatever the variable name is, state variable name is. questions.
I think I'm still a little bit confused. So that set counter is an anonymous function that's updating our counter. But I guess how's that happening? Where's the function defined?
The function is
how-
defined inside of the useState hook method. So this useState defines that function for us. It gives us that function.
Guess what is it? It's set with an initial value of 0, but what is it updating it to?
We haven't just defined that yet. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. All right. And what this is called destructuring. So useState returns, again, two values. One of them's called counter, and we're calling it counter. And another one we're calling set counter. So let's just go back to our app. And let's talk about the React Dev Tools. Has anybody heard of the React Dev Tools before? If you are using Chrome or Mozilla, they have plugins or Chrome extensions. And I've got one that's installed that tells you what web pages are using React. So if you go to Chrome extensions, go to extensions, type in React Dev Developer Tools, and here is the React Developer Tools. Install it, because it'll give you this little thing that says this page is using the development build of React. And in order to inspect this, I can open this up. So open up the console, or not the console, but it gives us an additional tab. If I come over here, I see I've got two tabs, components and profiler. Inside of the components, it'll tell me what components this React app is using. So I've got a React app called app. And then if I click on that, it'll tell me what data values I have within that component. Like what is my state properties, what props are passed in, etc. So if I click on that, now it says inside of my app component, I have props. I don't have any props, but I have one state variable with a value of 0. If I change that value of 0 to say 10 and click save and click my app again, now I have a state of 10. So this is good to inspect of what data is being passed into what components. So, and don't worry, you'll get plenty of practice with this.
And state was unique to a component, correct? It's not outside of this component. It just affects things inside of it.
Correct. So, and you can create as many state variables as you want. So if I wanted to say like name, set name, and the initial value is Tom. If I come back here, open that up, I have a state of 10 and one of Tom. Let's see. Just want to see if this, nope. All right. Typically parse. So, okay, cool. So now I click that little, if I refresh that, if I click this parse hook names, so it'll scan and see what the variable names of those names are. So one is called counter, one is called name. All right. So what if I wanted to display how many times this counter has been clicked? So I'm just going to put that back to 1. I'm going to say yeah. So if I say I have been clicked and I want to add this counter variable within my JSX. I use square bracket or what is it called?
Squiggly.
Yeah, squiggly brackets. That's curly braces. Thank you. Curly bracket. And I can put counter in there. So I can add any JavaScript variables in between there. So if I come back here and it gives me some warnings, warnings aren't errors, which are good. So it still compiles. It just says, hey, set counter is assigned a value, but never used. Name is assigned a value, but never used within the component. And set name is assigned a value that's never used. Now it says I have been clicked 0 times. All right. Now let's actually go ahead and create a button. Click me. So now I have a button that says click me. And when I click this, I want it to update state. So I want it to update this counter variable. So on my button HTML or JSX element, I can add any, just like you added like event listeners to JSX, or I'm sorry, to JavaScript, like add event listener click or submit or on hover. You can add event listeners directly to these HTML elements. So I'm going to add an on click. And this on click is going to execute a function called handle button click. So I have to do, and I'm doing it in curly braces because this is a function. So I'm doing inline JavaScript inside of this JSX. So I'm going to have to define a handle button click function. So inside of this component, I'm going to create a function called handle button click. That when I call it, it's going to update this set counter value. So I can say set counter equals counter plus 1. Let's see if that works. So set counter is taking in the pass value and I'm adding 1 to it. So if I run that and I click me, now it's updating in real time.
Without reloading the page.
Yeah, so it's nothing's happening. It's just updating in real time.
When you say nothing's happening, you mean there's no additional get or post requests. Everything's loaded up
Yeah.
to the front. Okay.
Yeah, this is all front end. There's no HTTP requests going on. So this function, this component is dynamically updating and it's automatically being rendered to the screen, to the client, to the browser. All right. Questions on that?
So you're basically defining a function handle button click that affects another function set counter and changes a variable called counter.
Correct.
Okay.
But I would call it a state variable. So you'll hear it updating state. So I'm updating the state to this component. So yeah, counter is a state variable because you can have other variables, but this is a state variable. And you never want to update counter directly. So if I run like counter, like as I said, plus equals 1 or counter plus plus, you never want to do that. You never want to update state directly like so, because you'll run into a bunch of issues. So All right, questions on this? All right. So let's go ahead and create another directory called components. And inside of here, inside of my components directory, I'm going to create a button component. And I'm going to create a functional based component called button. That's literally, say H1. Yeah. So I just want to, so this is my button clicking app. You've clicked this 9 times. So if when I do a hard refresh, everything gets set back to 0. All right. So there we go. So if you don't have this already installed, so if you notice how I just went like RSC and it automatically gave me the skeleton to a function-based component. So inside of VS Code extensions, there is, if you just type in React, is it simple React snippets? So there's some React snippets that you can use to quickly create the skeleton to a, maybe it's React Redux. Yeah, so it's highly encourage you to download ES7 React Redux. What is that? Native snippets. Here's that. Because that will give you some React snippets that will make your life a lot easier. So RSC, create a React stateless component, functional based component called button. I'm already importing React. You don't really need to do that quite yet, but, and then it automatically exports it. So what I'm going to do is extrapolate this counter use state handle button click, and I'm going to put it into my button component. So I'm going to have to import also use state, and I'm going to add, I'm going to extrapolate that, bring that over here. So what I did is just created a button component, or it could be a counter component or whatever. That literally just says I've been clicked this many times, and it consists of a button with an on click event handler that executes this handle button click that literally just updates the counter. So inside of my app now, I can get rid of that use hook, the use state hook, and just render this button component. So I imported button from the components button, and now I'm rendering this button component. So what questions do you have about that?
If you had multiple instances of that button component, it would manipulate the same variable, right? Would it manipulate the same use state variable across instances? Since you're not, okay.
We can check that out here in a second. So I've got my button component right here, and I'm clicking it, and everything is still working. So now you can kind of see, here's my app component. And now I can look in my button component and there's the state. We have counter. But what's nice about components in React is everything's dynamic. So if I wanted to create 100 buttons, I'm going to do const create buttons. And what I'm going to do is I'll just say buttons, let buttons or counter array. And I'm going to say for let I equals 0, I is less than 100, I plus plus. And I'm looping through. This is 100 times. And I'm going to do counter array, or I'll call it buttons array, actually. Buttons array. And I'm going to push a button component. Oh. At the very end, I'm going to return this buttons array. So, yeah. So does anybody have any questions about what this create buttons function does?
Just creates what, 99 button?
We'll create I'll create 100 of them because it's starting at 0. But yeah.
Oh, so 100 button components.
Yep, it's going to create an array of 100 button components. And then down here, I'm going to execute that create buttons component or create buttons function. And I'm executing it. So let's create buttons right here, and I'm executing that. So if I come back, I've got 100 buttons. And it says, warning, each child in a list should have a unique key property. Check the render method of app. Okay, so it's giving me a warning. When you're rendering something that has a list of components like this, each element or each component needs a key property. Key, and that key property must be unique for each component. So what can I use that can identify each? So yeah, I can use I, like so. And now if I do that and refresh, I don't get that error anymore, or that warning. Now, if I click each button, will they all update or will they update individually? Does anybody have any guess? Or
Individually.
Because of you named them different.
I named it different.
Oh, you gave them a different ID.
If I didn't give them a different ID, would they update the same or differently?
Differently.
So I got differently.
I'll say same.
I'll guess same, just because I would have expected like this keyword, but I'm not sure because you're creating different components. But I'll take the other side.
So again, what's nice about React is that you can pass in different arguments or variables into so here it's like rendering the same component. The only difference is it's being the data within that component is different. So just like here, create buttons, we're rendering the same component, but the data in here might be different. So let's go back here. If I click it, it clicks one each individual, updates one each. Each one is unique. Think of each component as a unique instance where that data is confined to that component. But I need that there. And even if I did that, everything still stays the same. Has anybody heard of the cookie counter or cookie clicker?
Yes.
Here is an online app that literally just, this is all the app is. It's got ads and everything, and it probably makes tens of thousands of dollars per year in ad revenue just by doing this. So we can create our own just like we did. Click me 9 times. Like so. Questions on that?
So this button component wouldn't be, it's an example, but it wouldn't be real useful on another page that didn't need a counter or a set counter. So we'd have to make it more generic, I guess, if we wanted to use the button component on a different page. Is that right?
Correct. So good observation. So if we wanted to make it more generic, such as I don't know how to make it more generic, but let's just say this is all it does is update, but maybe we can add something like whose component this, or whose button is this? Is it Tom's component? Is it, Devin's component? Is it Melissa's component? And that can be updated by passing in props. So if we come back here, props, or so component can accept data as props, and props is a reserved keyword similar to passing arguments to a function. So inside of my button, I'm going to pass in the keyword props. And what props is going to be, I'm going to say it's going to be a name. And I'm going to say and props is going to have a name value to it. So I'm going to say props.name button. So Tom button, Melissa button, whatever has been clicked so many times. So if I come back here, it doesn't show anything, but if I open up the components and I click on there, it doesn't have a prop to it yet because I'm not passing in props to that function yet, or to this component. And there is a way I can pass in props to this function. It's essentially like how I'm doing it here. I can pass a name equals Tom or whatever. In fact, I'm going to say list of names JSON. Oh, come on. Sweet. Perfect. How big is this? I don't want it to be that big. What the hell just happened? So I'll just do like a few of names. Oh, great. My computer's slowing down. I'm just going to grab those names. And I'm going to say like list let names equals. Oh, it's ugly. Sorry. There's an easier way to do this. So I've got a list of names, and say, instead of creating 100 names, I'm going to pass in a name by going names.i. So if I come back here, it says Aaron button has been clicked that many times. And now you can see the props that are passed into button. So I'm passing a name property, names at I, because I'm looping through this list. Yeah, I'm looping through this list. I'm passing each individual name as a property called name into the button component. So that when you pass it in, when you invoke a component like this, and you pass in some call what looks like an attribute, it's actually a prop, and the value automatically gets passed in to the props button component. So I'm passing in props in here. So there's a name property. So props.name equals this value, which equals all these values. So now you can kind of see.
So name is just what you named it. It doesn't have to be something specific.
Nope, I can call it like first name. But then when I call this, I can say first name. And there, everything
So
still
you
works.
said it, kind of setting it as an attribute in one file. And
yeah, up until this point, these have been called attributes when we've just been dealing with HTML elements. But in JavaScript, or I'm sorry, in React, when it's attached to a component, it is called a property or a prop. So you can see how many times they've been clicked. One last thing. We'll talk about class-based components real quick because you will see it in some of the challenges. If I wanted to change this to a class-based component, there are some differences that I'll have to do. So if I'm just going to copy that down here, and I'm going to comment that out. I'm going to say class-based component. I can say class button. Does anybody know how a class, how I can do inheritance in JavaScript using OOP? Was that covered on Saturday?
Like it extends.
Yep. So the button class is going to inherit from the component class from React. So I'm going to have to pass in the component. So I'm going to have to import the component class. And now classes, they don't return anything. Well, they do. The last thing that a class, when I invoke a button class-based component, the last function that is called a render method. So, and that render method will return JSX like so. But now, how we actually create state in class-based components is a little bit differently. So we don't use hooks anymore. We just define a variable called state, and state is always an object. And now I can do counter equals 0, like so. So this is how I define state in a class-based component. I need to call the keyword state is a reserved word, and it has to be an object because I can add additional attributes here, different additional state variables. And then handle click. You don't call const when you define variables or argument or functions in class-based components. So it's just handle button click. And in order to update state in a class-based component, there's a reserved method to update state, and that is set state. But this is class-based OOP. So instead of what do we need? What is similar to the word keyword self?
This.
Yeah. So we need to use this dot set state, which is a function that takes in the state object, and we can call counter equals. And in order to grab that initial value of the state counter, because in here we're doing set state counter +1, which is counter, we need to access this value first. So we need to do this dot state dot counter +1. And then when we access these variables within, or the state and props within the function or within the JSX, we needed to add the this keyword before the first name, the props, as well as the this on the counter, as well as the this for the handle button click. Because again, this is OOP, we need to call the this keyword. And in JavaScript or in functional based components, we explicitly had to pass in props as an argument. In class based component, we're not passing in props anywhere. Props are automatically passed down from the parent component, app.js, down to the button component. So we can just literally say first name equals names at I, and first name will already be automatically be passed in as a property. So if I come back here and I refresh this, it's been clicked 0. Oh, not this. This dot state dot counter. There we go. And now everything is still working, and I've got no errors or anything. I just wanted to quickly show you class-based components because you will see it.
You said the most current versions of React are kind of moving away from this because they want to get rid of some complexity, correct?
Correct. So this is the old way. Everything is going to be the new way. So if you want to just work using functional based components, I encourage you to do so. But we will talk about class-based components and talk about the different complexities of class-based components throughout the next several weeks.
So class-based, it kind of still works the same way. It goes to index.js.
Yeah, everything else is the same.
Okay.
Yep. The only difference is literally just how you invoke or declare or define the components. All right. Does anybody have any questions?
In your app.js on line 12, you're returning an array of components. So you can either return a component by itself, an array, or there are other data types it can take.
That's pretty much it. And I can also, since I'm using an array to loop through, I can remove that. Yeah, so if I got rid of that, I can say return names dot map And that takes in a name. And that can return a button with a first name equals name. And that should also work. Let's see if that worked. The only difference is I need to add a unique key to that. So you'll see it like this too. If you're looping through it explicit, I'm returning a array maps, and the map function returns that. Or in the inside of the map function, you need to return something. So this also works. All right. Any questions? All right. I'm going to stop the recording.